Welcome back. Lecture 9.3. We're still with the system of process type. So one of the core systems within the system of transitivity, the resources of the lexicogrammar, the grammar of the clause, for construing our experience of the flow events, for construing a quantum of change out of the flow events, representing it as a figure, as a configuration of process plus participants plus circumstances. By way of a very brief recap, let me return to Michael Lunig. His representation here of somebody taking a selfie, bird sitting on the selfie stick, and the man saying, "Get off my selfie stick, you egotistical narcissist." Now, interpersonally, this is an imperative clause. So in the system of mood type, the selection is imperative, realizing a command. Interpersonally, of course, it also has evocative element, you egotistical narcissist. So the enactment of the relationship between the man and the bird is negative affect. Experientially, the command is concerned with a material clause, get off my selfie stick. The process representing a material clause of motion, a motion away from one location towards another, or simply away from one location. And this realizes a quantum of change that we can characterize as doing and happening, motion through space. Now, it so happens that in many texts, this is a common combination. Mood type imperative, process type material. For example, in recipes. So we'll see this illustrated later on. Let me now introduce more systematically a third major process type. So we've looked at material and then mental by way of introduction with reference to comics. Let me now introduce a third major process type. We'll continue to quote from Halliday Matheson 2014, Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar. In addition to material and mental processes, the outer and inner aspects of our experience, a third component has to be supplied before this can become a coherent theory of experience. We learn to generalize, to relate one fragment of experience to another in some kind of taxonomic relationship. This is the same as that. This is a kind of the other. Here the grammar recognizes the process of a third type, those of identifying and classifying. We call these relational process clauses. As usually means mostly. Sorry, scratch that. For instance, every fourth African is a Nigerian. This comes from an interview with Chinua Achebe. This is a classic classifying relational clause. In contrast, the three major groups in the nation are the Yoruba in the southwest, the Igbo in the southeast, southeast, and the Hausa finally in the north. This is an identifying clause, setting up the identity between the three major groups in the nation and then the exhaustive list of these groups. The Yoruba in the southwest, the Igbo in the southeast, and the Hausa in the north. Notice that this second clause is actually reversible. So the Yoruba in the southwest, the Igbo in the southeast, and the Hausa in the north are the three major groups in the nation. There's a difference between classifying and identifying. Identifying relational clauses can usually be reversed, but we'll come back to that. We'll give you another example, just contrasting material and relational clauses. Again from Michael Lunig. So this is a sequence of 4 panels in an ongoing exchange between these two characters. One says, "What are you doing?" Another one says, "I'm using my device." This is material representing doings and happenings. Okay. Then the second panel, what is your device? My device is the sky. This is setting up a relationship between what and your device and my device and the sky. Third panel, does your device have any applications? Have many applications? Yes, it has sun, moon, clouds and birds. And the fourth panel, again material. And do you have to recharge your device very often? I don't have to recharge my device, it recharges me. So the first and the fourth panel, these are material. There's something about the tense. What are you doing? I'm using my device. Rather than what do you do? I use my device. So the unmarked way of representing present time in material clauses is the present and present, also known as the present continuous, present progressive. So what are you doing rather than what do you do? That is narrowing down to the now, to the now speaking rather than the extended now. I'm using my device. Again, narrowing down to the time of speaking rather than I use my device, which would be generalized, habitual. The other two examples, these are relational. What is your device? My device is the sky. Notice against the tense here, it's just a simple present. What is your device? Rather than what is your device being? And my device is the sky, rather than my device is being the sky. And in this third panel, does your device have many applications? It's another kind of relational clause where the relationship is one of having parts, part-whole relations. Does your device have many applications? Yes, it has sun, moon, clouds and birds. Notice again the set tense, the simple present. So does your device have many applications? Rather than is your device having many applications? And it has sun, moon, clouds and birds, rather than it is having sun, moon, clouds and birds. You have this contrast then between material and relational. And note, as I said, the present tense elections are doing versus is. This is one of a number of differences, grammatical differences between material and relational clauses. Semantically, material clauses tend to represent changes where there's a clear difference between the initial state and the final state, the outcome, whereas relational clauses, there's a kind of continuity of the relationship, say the identity of the device and the sky. So let's explore the third type, being and having, that of relational clauses, a model for construing experience in terms of classifying, set membership, and identifying, as we've just seen. And to begin with, we can interpret it as a model for construing outer experience, complementing the material model, but with one significant difference. When we think about it in terms of representing outer experience, then the contrast is something like dynamic versus static. Experience of the world outside, model as doing and happening, is unfolding in distinctive phases. As I just said, typically initial phase, initial state, is distinct, different from the end state, the outcome. That's characteristic of material clauses. In contrast, experience of the world outside model as being and having, unfolding as a uniform phase, so no change from state to state or phase to phase. And that's characteristic of relational clauses. Again, let's see how this is reflected in the conventions of comic strips. Both the experience represented by material clauses and the experience represented by relational clauses can be represented in comic strips purely pictorially. Language isn't necessary because it's outer experience, experience of the world outside. So here you have an example. You have a clear sense of motion, where you can interpret a vector, as it were, where the car is moving from one location to another. And in a way, in fact, the way you would describe this is We say the car is driving towards Marlin's Pike Hall. Molinzak, the captain's home, is driving. Like, what are you doing? In contrast with another panel from the same story, where simply a static representation of Captain Paddock's home with no implication of change over time, unlike the representation of the car, which we clearly interpret when we view this image, this picture, as moving, but there is no indication of movement in the picture to the right. And indeed, if we represented this in English, we'd say Marlin's Pike Hall is in the center of the estate, rather than Marlin's Pike Hall is being in the center of the estate. So that's again a difference. Or if we wanted to say Marlin's Pike Hall is Captain Haddock's home, not Marlin's Pike Hall is being Captain Haddock's home. So again, notice the tense selection. Are driving, is the present in present, or present progressive continue, or present continuous versus a simple present. So I've now briefly introduced three basic process types: material, mental, and relational. These are the major types, but you also in fact have in English, you have three minor types: behavioural in a sense between material and mental, and verbal in a sense between mental and relational, and then existential in a sense between relational and material. Let me go back to Halliday Matheson 2014. The three principal types of process in the English clause: material, mental, relational. They are the three principal types. They are the principal types in that they are the cornerstones of the grammar in disguise as a theory of experience. They present three distinct kinds of structural configuration, three domains of experience, and they account for the majority of all clauses in text. Material and relational seem to be roughly balanced in frequency over the language as a whole, so across different text types, register genres, followed by mental, although the pattern varies considerably among different registers, different text types or genres. We can then go on to recognize three subsidiary process types, located each of the boundaries, as I already suggested. Behavioural at the boundary between material and mental, verbal at the boundary between mental and relational, and existential at the boundary between relational and material. Let me give you figure 5.3 here. If you feel it's a bit too tiny, that can be remedied. Let me magnify it. So you recognize the principal types: material, mental, relational, and then the in-between, the subsidiary ones: behavioural, verbal, and existential. And for now, I'll focus on verbal clauses, leaving behavioural and existential for later. So what are verbal clauses? Well, verbal clauses construe the externalization of sensing as saying. That's one way of characterizing them. They constitute part of the grammar's theory of moves in dialogic exchanges. So in stories, for example, when we represent people dialoguing, we use verbal clauses. So you could characterize them as centrally being concerned with the externalization of consciousness. So let me represent them like this: the material versus relational aspects of our external experience as dynamic change, different phases of the process unfolding through time, and relational, uniform unfolding of the process over time, then the inner experience of mental, and then verbal, as it were, as externalizing the inner experience, the experience of consciousness, as locutions, as what people say to one another. So the mental ones are, among other things, they're concerned with process of consciousness, including perception, seeing, hearing, smelling, and so on. Whereas verbal clauses are concerned with saying, their process of saying. Like mental clauses, verbal clauses can project clauses representing, but what do they represent? Well, the content of saying, but the content of saying is not ideas, but locutions, often characterized as indirect or direct speech. And again, as with processes of consciousness, the content of saying, just as the content of sensing, of consciousness, is reflected in special partitions in comics. So if we return to Hergé and Tintin, we have this exchange between Captain Haddock and Tintin. Haddock says to Tintin, "Rubbish. Dreams go by opposites, so they say. Don't think about it. Look, there's a letter for you from Hong Kong." Hong Kong? Now the sayers are depicted, and we can infer the process of saying. They are represented by these two figures, these two characters. But the content of saying, the locutions, just like the ideas brought into existence by sensing, the content has to be represented in special partitions, what we know as speech balloons. So if you look to the left, the sayer and the saying, the process of saying, are represented pictorially. But what the sayer's saying brings into existence, projects into existence, that has to be represented by language in a speech partition, a speech balloon. And if we were to verbalize the whole thing, we'd say Captain Haddock said to Tintin, something along those lines, "Rubbish, dreams go by opposites," etc. So rounding off this introduction to process type, let me give a couple of examples of the analogues in comics for construing quanta of change in the flow of events, illustrating the way in which the pictorial and linguistic systems are deployed together, complementing one another to represent different domains of experience, of our experience of change, as a narrative is developed panel by panel. Again, remember that a key issue is, can the experience be depicted? Is it enough to draw it? Or is language needed to come in to construe, to represent a higher order of experience? So here's a sequence of two panels. You see, in the first panel, there is, of course, the experience of a representation of outer experience, what can be depicted. But then you have both sensing and saying, and the content of sensing and the content of saying, they have to be represented in the partitions. In Milou's snowy speech balloon, thought cloud, "Golly, what's the matter? He's tied up." And in Tintin's speech balloon, "Go on, Snowy, go on." Then the next panel, in principle, this is represented without language. So there is no higher order of reality, neither inner consciousness or the externalization of inner consciousness needing language to be represented. Now you have sound effects, scrunch, crunch, crunch, but there's simply language being brought in to represent sound effects. And here's a longer sequence. But again, you can see the complementarity. You have panels with only depiction, only the pictorial system, maybe with sound effect. And then you have panels with representation of consciousness and representation of, so sensing and representation of saying. So you can scan this comic and you see the switch between the panels that represent simply what we would express as material clauses in language, and ones that involve saying, so verbal clauses plus quotes, and sensing, in particular last one with Captain Haddock, thundering typhoons. Some people travel for fun. Notice, incidentally, in the panel, interestingly, relating back to what we're talking about before, the choice of what to represent, whether to do it close up, simply showing the landing gear, or showing the whole plane. So it's very much like we'd expect from a storyboarding of a film, of a movie. So running through the different process types, checking how they're represented in comics. So we have the verbal ones with speech balloons. We have the mental ones with thought clouds. Material ones, where there is a clear implication in the drawing of change over time, change from one phase to another, change of state. So we can infer, in this case, a vector of motion, the change being change in location in space, versus the relational ones, where the representation of the unfolding through time is uniform. There's no indication of change from one state to another. So to sort out these, we have two kinds of representations that cannot project, as it were. There's no indication of conscious experience. Contrast here is between static and dynamic. If dynamic, then the equivalent would be in language material clauses, clauses of doing and happening, like process of motion. Static, no change over time, no perceptible change over time. Equivalent would be relational clauses, being, having, or possibly existential. Simply saying, Captain Haddock's home is in the park. And then the ones that can project, either ideas in the thought clouds, mental clauses in English, clauses of sensing, and then the ones that can project locutions, represented by language and speech balloons, in English verbal clauses, clauses of saying, plus the locutions that are quoted or reported. So this is the end of lecture 9.3. Next, we will continue with process type, and I'll give you some more text illustrations. So what I'm trying to do is gradually build up a picture of the resources of the grammar of experience, specifically the grammar of experience of the clause, where the experience the grammar is concerned with is that of the flow of events, and the contribution of the grammar of the clause is to chunk the flow of events into quanta of change and to sort them into different kinds of change, different domains of change, the process types. Have a break. Thank you.